you not to worry, but maybe that's a lie. Honey, what's your hurry? Won't you stay inside? Remember not to get too close to stars. They're never gonna give you love like ours. Where did you go? I should know, but it's cold and I don't wanna be lonely. So show me the way home. I can't lose another love.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the second annual White Hat Conference. If you're just joining us, we're about to move into our first student paper session. So during this session, the paper competitions, the winners number 1 and 2 will be presented in last name order. And then a discussion will be led by our discussant, Dr. Claire Lee, and Dr. Jae-Young Choi. Will be the moderator during this session and will introduce our presenters' bios. So Dr. Jae-Young Choi, if you'd like to take it away.
Hi everyone, my name is Jae-Young Choi. I'm an assistant professor of criminal justice at Angelo State University. I am honored to serve as the organizer of the student paper competition this year. Thank you for taking your time to be here today. Today, we are going to announce the 4 winners of the student paper competition for the 2021 White Hat Conference. After the student winners make their presentations in the following 2 sessions, the awards ceremony will follow. Before moving on, I would like to briefly mention about how the evaluation process was conducted. Many students have submitted their abstracts and papers. I reached out to the 3 reliable and competent researchers in the field of criminology to serve as judges. Thankfully, they agreed. I created the rubric to evaluate the student papers, and the rubric was revised and finalized by reflecting the 3 judges' comments. The revised rubric was used to quantify and score the submitted papers. The manuscripts were blinded. In other words, the judges did not know the author's information. The 3 judges sent me the rubrics and their comments for each paper individually, and I compiled the results to summarize the scores. As a result, the 4 winners of the paper competition were selected. Today, the 2 knowledgeable scholars will join the student paper presentation session. Dr. Claire Seung Lee, an assistant professor of criminology and justice studies at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, will serve as a discussant in the first session. Dr. Lee is a member of the Center for Internet Security and Forensics Education and Research. Her research has been funded by numerous organizations and agencies. She is currently serving as the treasurer and secretary of the Division of Cybercrime at American Society of Criminology. Chris Kaiser, the founder and the president of Cybercrime Analytics from Canada, will serve as a discussant for the second session. Chris is a member of Kata Alliance, Kata's e-commerce, e-crime cyber council. Chris has authored 2 books, including a book about cybercrime. During the first student paper presentation session, 2 students will present their papers. Sydney from the University of Scranton will make the first paper presentation. She'll present her findings regarding cybercrime and COVID-19. Then Ji-sun from Seoul National University will present her research involving North Korean cyber attacks. Without further ado, let's begin with student paper presentations.
Hello, my name is Sydney Jarrow, and I'm a student at the University of Scranton studying criminal justice. This semester, my research advisor, Dr. Sinchol Bak, and I conducted an empirical study on cybercrime during the COVID-19 pandemic. Advances in technology and cyberspace have transformed how we live and continue to do so every day. Technology has even created an emerging field of crime, cybercrime. Information technology and interconnectivity facilitate cybercriminals to utilize the internet to exploit online users. Given that, it can provide more criminal opportunities. Moreover, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the worlds of crime and cybercrime. The nationwide lockdowns and mandatory stay-at-home orders necessitated by the pandemic have caused non-essential businesses and K-12 public schools to close. As a result, work, school, and social gatherings have switched to cyberspace. Therefore, more people are using the internet to continue their lifestyles as normally as possible. This increased internet use then heightens individuals' exposure to cybercriminals and their deviant acts. Since the onset of the pandemic, researchers have conducted studies to investigate how the pandemic has changed the world of cybercrime and victimization. However, no study has empirically examined the relationship between the COVID-19 pandemic and cybercrime victimization, focusing on malware infections in the United States. We believe the societal changes as a result of the pandemic significantly contribute to changes in cybercrime. Therefore, our study explores the relationship between malware infections, COVID-19 reported positive cases, closed non-essential businesses, and closed K-12 public schools. It is important first to review past research and acknowledge their findings. Recent studies have found that the COVID-19 pandemic has considerably altered crime. Some findings specifically include a decrease in property crimes in March and April of 2020, a decrease in minor group offenses, an increase in business burglaries, and an increase in crimes committed alone, such as intimate partner violence and homicide. More importantly, the COVID-19 pandemic has influenced cybercrime around the world. Lally et al. In a 2020 global study found that phishing and malware infections were the two most prominent types of cybercrime during the pandemic. A study from the UK found an increase in cybercrime and online fraud during the pandemic. However, a study from the US found no increase in cybercrime victimization. Therefore, in this regard, the current study expects to contribute significant information to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on cybercrime victimization. Our paper also utilizes the routine activities theory proposed by Cohen and Felsen. This theory explains the three components needed for a crime to occur: a motivated offender, a suitable target, and the absence of a capable guardian. More use of the internet, necessitated by the pandemic, may increase the potential for motivated offenders. Furthermore, unemployment as a result of the pandemic is a factor that may increase the number of motivated offenders, due to a heightened need for money and a greater motivation to steal. Increased use of the internet can also create a larger number of suitable targets. Many research studies have also identified specific deviant computer activities that increase risks for victimization, such as viewing pornography, free streaming, and peer-to-peer sharing. Other non-deviant computer activities that increase the risk for victimization include watching movies and visiting dating websites. A capable guardian can be either an element or a person that prevents a crime from occurring. With cybercrime, a capable guardian could also take the form of antivirus protection or software. Interestingly, some studies have found that antivirus software increases the risk for victimization. We also specifically reviewed research concerning online exposure to malware infections. Demographic predictors for victimization include unemployed younger males who live independently from their parents and have a less active offline social life. Other factors that increase one's vulnerability are public computer use, insecure Wi-Fi connections, and a lack of knowledge or inability to identify malware. On the other hand, a better economic situation is associated with a lower risk of cybercrime victimization. Interestingly, many studies examined personality traits that influence the risk for victimization. One study found that more open individuals had a higher risk for victimization, while those with high conscientiousness and emotional stability had a lower risk. Other personality traits that increase risks for victimization include impulsivity and lower self-control. However, there is limited research on the relationship between malware infection specifically and closed non-essential businesses in K-12 public schools, as well as daily COVID-19 positive case numbers. Given that, we hypothesize the following relationships. 1, there is a positive relationship between closed non-essential businesses and malware infections in the US. 2, there is a positive relationship between closed K-12 public schools and malware infections in the US. And 3, there is a positive relationship between daily COVID-19 positive cases and malware infections in the US. Data utilized in the study derives from the Kaspersky Cyber Threat Real-Time Map, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the COVID-19 U.S. State Policy Database over the course of 6 months from January of 2020 to June of 2020. The Kaspersky Cyber Threat Real-Time Map was used to collect daily numbers of malware infections. The CDC was used to collect daily reported positive COVID-19 cases. Lastly, the COVID-19 U.S. State Policy Database was used to collect data for closed non-essential businesses and closed K-12 public schools. The dependent variable for cybercrime victimization was measured by the number of malware infections in the U.S. per day. The independent variables were closed non-essential businesses, closed K-12 public schools, and reported COVID-19 positive cases. Using SPSS 27, we first produced descriptive statistics for the variables used in the study. The means for malware infection and COVID-19 positive case numbers were respectively 330,007 and 14,437. The standard deviation for both of these variables were respectively 22,609 and 13,841. Prevalence rates for closed non-essential businesses was 18%, which is equivalent to 33 days out of 182 days. Prevalence rates for closed K-12 public schools was 41.2%, which is equivalent to 75 days out of 182 days. Also using SPSS 27, we analyzed the bivariate relationship between the variables. All three independent variables had significant relationships with malware infection numbers. In line with these results, we tested the three hypotheses using the ordinary least square regression models. Model 1 indicates that there is a statistically significant positive relationship between closed non-essential businesses and malware infection victimization. This result indicates that closed non-essential businesses in the US is positively associated with US malware infection numbers, which is the predicted direction of hypothesis 1. Model 2 adds two variables to account for differences in closed K-12 public schools. As shown, the COVID-19 positive numbers variable is a statistically significant predictor of malware infection numbers. Moreover, the effect of closed non-essential businesses remains statistically significant. However, the closed K-12 school variable is not a statistically significant predictor of malware infection number. In summary, these results reveal that closed non-essential businesses and COVID-19 positive case numbers have been influenced by the increasing likelihood of malware infection victimization, whereas closed K-12 public schools were not associated with the likelihood of malware infection victimization. Given that, the findings of the study support hypotheses 1 and 3. As a result of the pandemic, many activities of non-essential businesses and K-12 public schools moved from physical space to cyberspace. K-12 public schools used online learning systems such as Google Classroom, Zoom, and Blackboard to continue teaching and learning through the pandemic. We believe these safe spaces used by students and teachers may have influenced the lower risk for victimization. Furthermore, as stated earlier, past research has indicated that deviant computer activity increases the risk for victimization. Therefore, adult individuals employed by closed non-essential businesses may have engaged in these types of acts, escalating their likelihood of victimization. Many individuals were generally unprepared for the sudden shift from physical space to cyberspace. At the same time, our society might not have had enough cybersecurity countermeasures which could prevent our virtual communities against maliciously motivated cybercriminals at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. As the emerging field of cybercrime significantly grows in the United States, there must be increased interest and concern regarding cybercrime prevention. The findings demonstrate a need to strengthen cybersecurity to eliminate threats and victimization. Secondly, the findings demonstrate a need to educate people, especially frequent internet users, on cybersecurity and cyber victimization, as well as increase cybercrime awareness as a whole. Heightened alertness and better recognition of the various types of cybercrime will prove beneficial to those with high risk for victimization. Although the study provides significant results on the relationship between malware infections and several aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic, the study has limitations that must be discussed. This study utilized data from a period of 6 months from January of 2020 to June of 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic did not directly affect the US until early March of 2020, and so future research can be directed towards the later months of 2020 and into 2021. In addition, future studies can design a longitudinal study that further investigates the relationship between these variables. Lastly, this study focused entirely on malware infections. Future research can focus on other types of cybercrime to explore if there are similar relationships with the 3 independent variables used in this study. Most importantly, through the present study, we have witnessed how the COVID-19 pandemic has changed our lives in both the physical and virtual realms. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jisung Hwang, and I'm studying politics and international relations at Seoul National University. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers of the student paper competition, who worked tirelessly to make this event a success. I would also like to thank my faculty advisor, Dr. Kyung-Sik Choi, for guiding me through the writing process of the paper. Through regular online meetings, I was able to discuss my progress and receive feedback, despite the difficulties posed by the time difference. Through these meetings, I was able to gain invaluable insights into North Korean cyberterrorism from a criminological perspective. I would also like to thank all of the experts who participated in the interviews that went into the paper. Lastly, I would like to thank all those who were able to participate today. Although this presentation is virtual, I am thankful that we are able to meet online. I now turn to the presentation of my paper, which is titled North Korean Cyber Attacks and Policy Responses, an Interdisciplinary Theoretical Framework. I will begin by introducing the current situation, the purpose of the paper, and the structure the paper follows. I will then introduce the 2 main theoretical frameworks we use to conduct analysis. Thirdly, I will introduce the methodology of the expert interviews. Next, I will present the best practices and policies based on the interview results. I will follow by discussing the policy implications of our analysis, and will end by presenting the conclusions and limitations of the study. The study conducts a qualitative analysis of the objectives, forms, current trends, and characteristics of North Korean cyber terror attacks. It also suggests the way to ensure further progress towards succeeding in an international policy response. So, why focus on North Korea's cyber attacks? Within the 21st century, cyberspace has become an area of importance in international security. Cyber attacks are an attractive option for pariah states such as North Korea that have limited military and economic resources. The rationale for North Korea's use of cyber war power as a strategic weapon is that it is cost-effective and easy to utilize, it spreads quickly, and it can cause huge repercussions. Moreover, there is no need for physical infiltration, anonymity allows for secrecy, and sanctions and retribution are difficult. These cyber attacks are expected to multiply in number as well as in form in the future. Unfortunately, there remains a general lack of academic discussion on North Korea's cyber terrorism, and there has yet to be an established international consensus on policy response. In an effort to direct attention to these circumstances, the study conducts an analysis of the objectives, forms, current trends, and characteristics of North Korean cyber terror attacks. We then suggest a way to further ensure progress towards formulating an international policy response based on the network theory of world politics. The 2 theoretical frameworks we focused on were the theory of differential opportunity and the network theory of world politics. The theories were used to analyze experts' individual views about policy response and to suggest a way of action that is currently not being addressed by states. In doing so, we aimed to consider the multifaceted and asymmetrical nature of cyber terrorism within the context of postmodern international politics. We used elements of the differential opportunity theory to describe the nature of North Korean foreign policy, subculture, ideology, and social learning mechanisms. These provided a greater understanding of the drivers behind cyberterrorism activities. In particular, we drew upon the factors of enemy, subculture, and differential association. The trend of North Korean cyber attacks followed three stages: enemy caused by the difference between legitimate purposes and means, the resulting subcultural creation, and differential association and learning that leads to the persistent development of cyberterrorism. The second theory we used was the network theory of world politics. The network theory provides perspectives about the concept of power that is crucial to the understanding of North Korea's cyberterrorism in an international setting and in formulation of policy response. In an effort to lay out a comprehensive international cooperation framework in response to North Korea's cyber attacks, we adopted perspectives from Kim's categorization of network power. Network power derives from the ties between nodes and from the network as a whole, not from individual nodes. Kim's categorization of network power includes collective, positional, and programming power, which will be explained shortly. Now I will move on to the methodology of the interview. The interview was structured so as to obtain responses about the trends, motivations, and impacts of North Korean cyber attacks, the strengths and weaknesses of current prevention efforts, effective prevention strategies, and suggestions to policymakers. After interviewing a total of 8 experts, the data collected was then subjected to a 2-level analysis. With regard to motivations and trends, we used the theory of differential opportunity, and in particular, the concepts of enemy, subculture, and social learning to analyze responses. After the initial analysis, a secondary, more intensive analysis was conducted with regard to policy formulation. The network theory of world politics, and in particular, the 3 concepts of collective power, positional power, and programming power, formed the basis upon which the responses were then analyzed. Now, on to the results of the analysis. The theory of differential opportunity focuses on situations in which actors internalize conventional goals but are unable to realize them legitimately. Viewed from the perspective of enemy, North Korean cyber attacks reflect the strategic interests of the state when rising sanctions and international isolation provide few avenues to realize them. Experts recognize that the conventional goals of state power and wealth inspired North Korea to develop its cyber-terrorist regime. All of the interviewed experts agreed that monetary gain in particular was a strong driving factor of cyber-terrorism. Responses also showed that motivations behind cyber-terror can arise from changing state goals. While information was given precedence in the past, current trends illustrate the role of financial opportunity in pushing cyber attacks forward, with many experts mentioning Bitcoin hacking and ransomware attacks. The responses pertaining to understanding North Korea's subculture and social learning system were less robust compared to the concept of enemy, which could be more easily observed by analyzing trends of cyber attacks from outside of North Korea. This was largely due to the reclusive nature of the state and the difficulty of knowing with any degree of accuracy the inner workings of North Korea's subculture and social learning apparatus. However, the responses in general showed that experts were aware of the social accepted status of cybercrime in North Korea's particular subculture, as well as of the social learning system in place to perpetuate the norms of the subculture. Moving on to best practices and policies. The first base of network power is the actor, which exercises collective power. This viewpoint implies that larger networks with more powerful nodes can exert power over other nodes or networks. In the area of counter-terrorist policy regulation, there has yet to be a networker that has the power to gather many nodes and exert enough collective network power to deter North Korea's cyber-terrorist activities. While an international agreement has been difficult to reach, most of the solutions suggested by the experts during the interview rested upon an urgent need for collective power in the international sphere, particularly in the form of interagency and international cooperation. The second phase of network power is the system, in which power derives from the organization and principles of the network itself, with the programmer having the power to design the rules of the game. Currently, the lack of unified policy and unstable relations with North Korea continue to prevent South Korea and other states from realizing potential to exercise programming power as middle powers. Nevertheless, experts have proposed several ways in which a certain level of centralization can be reached. Creation of a central oversight organization, while ensuring that issues such as privacy are respected, requires the rules of the game to be crafted in a way that enhances efficiency while not compromising values upheld by private and public networks. The third phase of network power is the process, which focuses on positional power, in which a switcher can control the level of access between networks. A concept central to the idea of positional power is the structural idea of centrality. A node with a high degree of betweenness centrality is at a structurally strategic position, which allows it to play the role of broker. The international status of positional power is not conducive to preventing North Korea's cyber-terrorist activities. Moreover, the decentralized nature of cyberspace makes positional power hard to exercise even within states. Experts suggested that states can play a brokerage role between the disparate networks of information and security. States can also play the role of broker between internal and external internet networks. Moving on to policy implications and discussion. Analysis from the perspective of the network theory of world politics, as well as insights from experts in cybersecurity, showed that policy needs to focus on the ability of governments to exercise positional, programming, and collective power. Collective power suggests policies change in the direction of creating comprehensive legal frameworks and forming stronger international agreement on response to cyber terror. Programming power suggests that governments include the public and private sectors when forming policy to deter cyber terrorism and to set the rules and norms of the game when it comes to cyber terror. Positional power suggests that governmental organizations or officers act as brokers between different networks. For example, between the networks of information technology and security in order to more effectively respond to cyber terror attacks. These policy implications can be categorized into legal frameworks and international cooperation, incident response, and education. This paper integrated theories from criminology and international relations into one comprehensive framework and analyzed interviews from experts in the area of cybersecurity to provide validity and specificity to its theoretical approach. However, the study also has several limitations. The sample size of experts available for interview was comparatively small at 8 experts, and the continued spread of COVID-19 prevented the researchers from conducting face-to-face interviews that could have yielded more specific answers. Future studies that incorporate a larger sample size of experts can contribute to generalization of the results found by this study. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation.
Hello, all. As introduced by Dr. Jae-young Choi, I'm Claire Seung Lee from UMass Rural. Great to be here today. First of all, I enjoyed reading your paper with great interest because I'm working on a similar topic. Your paper looks at malware infection during the COVID-19 pandemic. Specifically, the paper investigates the relationship between the number of malware infection, COVID-19 positive cases, the close number of businesses and public school in the US. This is a great addition to ongoing COVID-19 related research. It deserves a lot of attention. While I provide my detailed comments and feedback in a written form, I'd like to use this time to ask 2 or 3 questions. So my first question to Sydney is, the study was conducted with a time frame of January to June 2020. However, in the US, the pandemic or the measures by the federal, state, and local authorities widely started around March 2020, if I remember correctly. I wonder how different the first 3 months, January to March 2020, would be different from the second 3 months, April to June 2020. You can split the data into 2 time frames and run the same analysis as you did exactly and compare the results. I assume that you can do this right away while listening to my question. What would you think this additional analysis results might change or convey?
Thank you for your question, Dr. Lee. To conduct this additional analysis, we would conduct a t-test to compare and determine whether there's a difference between the first 3 months and the second 3 months. Generally, I believe this additional analysis would convey the considerable differences between the 2 timeframes, like you mentioned in your question, and I also wrote in the discussion section of my paper. The COVID pandemic did not directly affect the US until early March of 2020. Therefore, I believe the first 3 months would convey the normal and average rates of malware infections during the pandemic, before the pandemic, excuse me. And I believe the second 3 months would convey the changing rates of malware infections since the onset of the pandemic, and also demonstrate its relationships with COVID-19 reported positive cases in both closed non-essential businesses and K-12 public schools. This overall comparison of the 2 timeframes would also convey how the pandemic had such a significant impact on malware infections. But I still think it was very important to incorporate the early months of 2020 into our study to see how the pandemic brought about so much change in both the US and the world of cybercrime.
Oh, great. Thank you for your great answers. Next, I'd like to ask you more about cybercrime in the post-COVID-19 era, which we are very much looking forward to. So you studied malware infection during COVID-19. I believe there are many other types of significant COVID-19 cybercrime victimization cases. Could you give the audience a snapshot of what other types and perhaps dynamic of COVID-19 cybercrime victimization and perhaps offending as well?
Thank you for your question. So while my paper focused on malware infection victimization, I did read substantial research on various other types of cybercrime and victimization during the pandemic. I read a global study that found that the most prominent type of cybercrime committed during the pandemic was phishing, with the second being malware infections. And phishing entails illegitimate parties inducing individuals to perform specific actions, whether that's sharing information or clicking on a link. And traditionally, cybercriminals would email or text links to individuals to lure them to a fraudulent website to attempt to collect personal information or even install malware. But now, since the onset of the pandemic, some cybercriminals are incorporating emotional appeals regarding the virus into their schemes to establish trust and eventually manipulate their victims. So this could include mentioning unemployment or stimulus checks, asking for donations, or just mentioning the CDC or the COVID-19 virus in general. This strategy is very alarming since many individuals can easily fall for it. So I'd like to warn internet users to especially watch out for these types of techniques and strategies that are being used.
Thank you very much for your answer and great advice. In fact, I have received some like unemployment scams in my mailbox a few times. Okay, I have a last question to Sydney, if I may. So that question is more about your future research agenda, which you mentioned during your presentation. So we all hope that COVID-19 comes to the end pretty soon. How do you see the new normal situation which means that COVID-19 will be less visible and we will go back to the normalcy of our life, will change cybercrime offending. Are there going to be more cybercrime after COVID-19? Do you think cyber criminals will use different new techniques of cybercrime, in particular for malware infection or any other types of any other types of cybercrime victimization and offending? And thank you very much in advance.
Thank you. So the COVID-19 pandemic, without a doubt, changed cybercrime, with more people at home using cyberspace to try to continue their lifestyles as normally as possible. The use of the internet skyrocketed and in turn provided more cybercriminal opportunities. In the new normal situation, I see cybercrime hopefully decreasing, even in the slightest, as more people return to work and school and overall rely less on cyberspace and the internet. However, I strongly believe cybercrime after the pandemic will never go away. The convenience and easy use of the internet will only increase as technology consistently advances, and cybercriminals are getting smarter and discovering new ways to manipulate victims by the day. I think that although cybercriminals may no longer be able to use the pandemic in their schemes, I think cybercriminals will continue to use the extraordinary or unexpected events and circumstances that happen around the world, whether it be a natural disaster, terrorism, political scandal, or in this case, a global pandemic, to continue to use such techniques and commit these malicious acts.
Thank you very much for you to share your ideas with me and the audience. I'm sure the audience will be very grateful for your presentation as well as I do. So next, I'd like to ask some questions to Jason. Good to meet you. Congratulations to be here as one of the winner of the student competition winner. So it's my honor to offer some comments. First, I really enjoyed reading your paper, which is important to the existing field. Your field and your paper explore the objectives, forms, current trends, and characteristics of North Korean cyber terror attacks, which is very underrepresented currently in the academic world. I like the fact that it uses a lot of interdisciplinary angle from criminology, political science, international security, and some other related areas. In fact, I found figure 1, best practices and policies regarding those Korean cyber attacks, addressing programming power, positional power, collective power that you also shown in the presentation. And I found it very useful when I reading your paper. And the figure 2 and figure 1 especially summarize your work very nicely. That's a great addition to your paper. While I provided my detailed comments and feedback in a written form, same as what I did for Sydney, in the interest of time and venue, I'd like to hear from you in terms of future first. Based on your research findings, if you can speculate what types of cyber attacks from North Korea would be plausible in the future.
Thank you for your comments and your question, Dr. Lee. The findings of my paper find that based on the motivations and subculture, as well as social learning systems in place in North Korea, the attacks will increase in number as well as in form in the future. And I thought that this was because of the necessity and ease of using cyber attacks, the alignment with state goals, and also the glorification of cyber attacks within North Korea. However, I do believe that in the future, rather than explicit attacks on governmental or public institutions, the change in motivation to financial goals will mark a change in the trend of cyber attacks as well. So I believe that there will be a larger number of actors involved, and it will become even harder to determine where these attacks are coming from. And as for the particular forms, ransomware, for example, is especially a problematic form of attack that I expect we will see more of in the future.
Oh, thank you very much for your informative answer to my futuristic question. I know we are not fortune teller, but yeah, your answer would be very helpful for the audience and me. So I presume you spend a lot of time working on this draft on South Korean expert opinion on North Korean cyber attacks. How do you think other nations, who are not South Korean experts' opinions might differ from the South Korean opinion?
Thank you for your question again. And like I mentioned in my paper, South Korea often bears the brunt of North Korea's cyber attacks. So I am assuming that the answers given by the South Korean experts are based on solutions that will facilitate quicker response. For example, the suggestion of establishing a centralized control agency within the state is necessary, especially if we are talking about defending against attacks in the foreseeable future. Experts in other states may opt for more effective coordination between agencies without everything being orchestrated by a central control center, depending on the administrative environment of each country. And another example I could think of is the difficulties that a nation may face when attempting to act as a broker between the two networks of information and security. So in countries where the norms regulating personal information and freedom from the state are stronger, I thought it may be easier to integrate these two networks. However, I do think that many of the suggestions by the South Korean experts can be accepted by experts in many other countries as well, as urgency for international cooperation is already being felt worldwide.
Oh yeah, I think the urgency and the importance of international cooperation is very important in the field of cybercrime and cyber attacks. I'm sure that's one of the most important things for North Korean cyber attacks in terms of our measures. Thank you for your thoughts about the differences in other countries and South Korean expert opinion. If I may, I have one more question. In your opinion, how would we increase public awareness and cyber ethics education in relation to general cyber attacks as well as North Korean cyber attacks? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Public awareness and cyber ethics education, they're both very important, but very often overlooked in practice. So I believe this is a very important question. And I believe the proliferation of these two measures will be facilitated if there is a wider understanding overall of the scope and scale of North Korean cyber attacks, as well as of their importance. I think that it's crucial that this message should get through because the public is often the target of North Korean cyber attacks. So it's not just governments that have to deal with this problem. As for cyber ethics education, I believe that it's necessary in order to maintain appropriate cyberspace behaviors for the next generation of computer users. And I believe that the government can encourage more education programs by exercising programming power, which I mentioned in the paper, within the country. So my hope is that eventually these norms will be extended to the global society in the future, so that collective power can arise as a result of the extension of cyber ethics norms.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much again for your answer. Thanks for sharing your ideas with me and the audience. I just got informed that we have a question from the floor who are watching this with us. It's already up here by Luciano to Sydney Guerrero. So I will read this out to Sydney, just in case you want me to read it out. Okay, so he's saying this like cybercrime is going up at an alarming rate, as you said, but we will depend even more on cyberspace. So what's your point of view in this? How do you think we can defend ourselves?
So, like I said before, technology is consistently advancing, and so we will always use the internet. We will always use cyberspace. Unfortunately, cybercrime will never disappear because of that. But personally, I hope internet companies can maybe take the first step by educating their users about popular strategies and techniques that are used, and maybe even provide examples that they often see used in their realm. And we will never be able to prevent cyber criminals from committing these types of crimes, but we can try to keep an eye out for them and do what we can to prevent them before they occur. We might not be able to completely rely on these companies to help us out. So I think it's important for everyone who uses the internet to read research about cybercrime, understand them, understand how they commit these crimes, and really just keep an eye out and know what to look for.
Thank you very much for your answer, Sydney. And thank you for attending this session. And I hope we can meet in person in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee and student presenters. This discussion session was very interesting and informative. It appears that the unique context, such as the pandemic, can play an important role in shaping cybercrime. Also, the unique environment, such as North Korea, should be further studied to prevent cybercrime. I appreciate students' efforts to illuminate these unique challenges in cyberspace. So that is the end of the first student paper presentation session. Thank you very much. I will see you guys in the second student paper presentation session. I will turn the floor to Andrew, the host of the event.
Thank you so much, Dr. Choi. That was a wonderful presentation that we had from our three students. We're going to go into a quick break here, and then we will be going into the next paper presentations, the paper competition winners. So we will be back after a short break here. We'll be back at 2 p.m. Eastern. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the second annual White Hat Conference. If you're just joining us, we are about to move into our second session where our student papers will be presented. We've got 2 more papers to be presented, after which a discussion will be led by our discussant, Chris Kaiser, and Dr. Jae-Young Choi will be the moderator during this session, and we'll introduce the presenters' bios. So Dr. Jae-Young Choi, please take it away.
Thank you, Andrew. So, hi guys, it is good to see you again. During the second student paper presentation session, 2 students will present their papers. Na-young from Gyeonggi University will present the findings of her study on juvenile prostitution in cyberspace. And Yeonjae from the University of Texas, Dallas will talk about her findings related to fear of online victimization. Now, I will yield the floor to the student presenters.
Hello, I'm Nayako from Gyeonggi University. My paper title is Effects of Disorder on Juvenile Prostitution in Cyberspace, the Application of SAPTE. The paper advisor is Junghyun Chang from Content Convergence Software Research Institute in Gyeonggi University. Begin with, I will explain some concepts. First, juvenile prostitution. In Republic of Korea, juvenile prostitution is a violation based on the act of the protection of the sex of children and adolescents. Following 2020 white paper on sexual crime, the current status of registered cases relating to prostitution is steadily increasing. See the graph among the victims of youth prostitution who visit supporting institutions, 87.2% showed that online is a path of sexual attraction. Therefore, we will focus on the aspect of online in juvenile prostitution. Second, SEPTID. SEPTID stands for Crime Prevention through Environmental Design. This is the way to prevent crime that eliminates the cause of crime by removing the environment in which crime can occur. Generally, SEPTID is divided into basic and additional components. The basic elements consist of natural surveillance, access control, and territoriality. And additional elements of SEPTID usually include activity support and maintenance and management. We will introduce the concept of cyber-SEPTID. Cyber-SEPTID is a cybercrime prevention strategy that aims to prevent cybercrime by applying the concept of SEPTID to cyber domains. Dennis Leber presented the concept of cyber-SEPTID. Cyber-SEPTID is discussed in conjunction with cybersecurity, focusing heavily on technical aspects. However, SEPTID in the real world has not required advanced technology. It means that we want to discuss a way to prevent crimes which occur in cyberspace in an easy and intuitive way. Before discussing the cyber-SEPTID, we would like to discuss whether SEPTID can be applied to cyberspace. It can be a discussion about the concept of space, and it is a question like, can cyberspace be considered as a physical space of a real society? To answer this question, we must know where the term cyberspace began. The word was first used in the novel New Romance by William Gibson. The real name of the term cyber is cybernetics. Cybernetics means a steerman and control. When the concept of cybernetics was urged, cybernetics was called the concept that implied artificial brain science. The reason is that winner includes a variety of interdisciplinary studies in the concept of cybernetics, typically linguistic, social messages, or computational psychological interdisciplinary theories. The cybernetics is a term for exchange of messages as a simultaneous process of communication and control, and its focus is on exchanging information. In modern times, the concept of cyber became meaningful as a technology that used computers or networks. This is a reduction of the original cybernetics concept. The main reason for the claim that cyberspace cannot be the same as the real world is that space is very physical. Therefore, cyberspace is just a metaphor for them. This is because the network is seemingly non-physical. The reason that we use space to cyber is interactive and capable of communicating with the majority perceived as forming a space. Physically, it is just a complex network of machines, but we can say that the social relationship in cyber makes cyberspace a virtual world, which is composed of cognitive experiences. However, the technique of interface has made the non-physical appear physical. Space is a physical thing, but in the end, it is artificially created. Space in reality is called space because it is perceived as space. The virtual space envisioned in the head by cognitive experience is not recognized as a visual effect. Also, both spaces have social relationships. Moreover, both spaces are where individuals act in relation to their daily lives. Phenomena such as crime is a social phenomenon that occurs between people and social issues. Therefore, whether in real life or cyber, we can call them spaces at least when discussing social phenomena such as crime. Back to SEPTID. SEPTID is a way to inhibit potential perpetrators' behavior. And it is obvious that if someone were to inhibit behaviors over the network, someone who recognizes the inhibition is people who are in reality. In this paper, we argue that SAPTID uses the method of exploiting the physical environment, and the principle is application to the cognition of sanctions against behavior. As a result, it is not applicable to physical environments only that can be touched. In other words, we can apply SAPTID on cyberspace. As the elements of SAPTID vary from researcher to researcher, we follow the concept of SAPTID, including natural surveillance, natural access control, territoriality, and 2 additional strategies. Natural surveillance is the principle of maximizing visibility by ordinary people. In cyberspace, because of its openness, anonymity, and non-face-to-face characteristics, people do not feel that they are under surveillance. We need to enable users to recognize that cyberspace is the same form as agrosphere, allowing users to naturally monitor and be monitored by others. As a result, if the concept of natural surveillance is applied to cyber-SAPTID, it is to censor and monitor activities in cyberspace, natural or voluntary, by the user's perception of surveillance. Access control makes access to targets difficult and increases the risk of criminal activity being exposed. In other words, it controls potential offenders from accessing their targets. The most common in cyberspace is a firewall. Access control is one of the most applicable concepts of SAPTID in cyberspace. Consequently, if the concept of access control of SAPTID is applied to cyber-SAPTID, it increases efforts to access a particular space or inhibits access in the first place. This will necessarily require clarity of territoriality in cyberspace. Territoriality is a hypothetical area in which local residents can claim their rights by using or occupying a particular area. In cyberspace, territoriality is usually presented in relation to information. However, creating boundaries for information is difficult. Consequently, if the concept of territoriality of SAPTID is applied to cyber-SAPTID, it should mean that users of a particular cyberspace use that space. In other words, territoriality in cyberspace is using public places to keep one's information. Active support is an additional strategy which reinforces natural surveillance by inducing and stimulating active use of public places. In cyberspace, active support in cyberspace will vary by nature between cyberspace. Thus, the type of activity support varies depending on what purpose the space is, but inducing the influx and active activity of users using the space will not differ significantly in SAPTID and cyber-SAPTID. Maintenance and management is also an additional strategy to ensure that certain facility or public places are continuously used as originally designed. In cyberspace, a space such as a program, software, or application is maintained and managed continuously. Regularly organizing programs is also a method of maintenance and management, and updating is also a method. We focus on the environment of cyberspace called random chat apps. Random chatting is a real-time online conversation service between unspecified users through text, voice, and video. It is often used in juvenile prostitution. SBS, which is Broadcasting Station in Republic of Korea, conducted an analysis of juvenile prostitution. They met 1,000 people, and among them, 31.9% chatted from sexual purposes, and among them, sex buying chatting was 25.6%. 265 people said the age doesn't matter in prostitution. On September 10, 2020, The Ministry of Gender Equality and Family established standards from harmful media for juveniles targeting the random chatting apps. These are about authentication, sharing, and reporting problems in app. This regulation seems to have or follow the concept of access control, surveillance, and territory. Also, by this regulation, all random chatting apps had to manage their app environment. However, we couldn't find out the concept of active support. After criminal action was taken against harmful apps, we look at 5 random chatting apps. There are age problems. The age setting value in the app didn't match the age of the app regulation. Also, some apps don't notify or warn about reporting. As a result, we think that to reinforce the elements of cyber safety in random chatting apps, there should be age limits both lower and upper. This is because most of the perpetrators are men in their 30s and 40s. And the applicable of safety while using app is weak. So we think that regulation of text seems essential, because usually they use text to communication. In conclusion, we focus on the cyber safety and the environment of random chat apps. The application of cyber safety can pose a problem that violates freedom in cyberspace. However, freedom without regulation is just a disorder. In reality, we have many regulations to share and communicate. Cyberspace is also space, so its culture, regulation, and rights must be properly established. The biggest limitation of this research is that no quantitative research has been done. Therefore, we expect it in subsequent studies. Also, the concept of cyberspace in legal terms must be clarified. Our research is meaningful to take a deep look at the concept of cyberspace, not just focusing on cybercrime and cyber safety. It can serve as a fundamental study of understanding cyberspace in studies dealing with the environmental aspect of cybercrime. This is our reference, and thank you for listening.
Hello, my name is Yeon Park from University of Texas at Dallas. The title of my study is Level of Engagement with SNS and Fear of Online Victimization, the Role of Online Victimization Experiences. Based on recently published data, the amount of cybercrime is significant, and the seriousness of online crime and victimization cannot be underscored. The United States Federal Bureau of Investigation reported that it received 791,790 cybercrime complaints in 2020. FBI also revealed that there was more than $4.2 billion worth of damage per year. This number of complaints was an increase of 69% compared to the year before. Victimization occurred every 14 seconds in 2019, and the frequency is expected to be reduced to once every 11 seconds in 2021. These cases involving massive damage indicated that cybercrime is a serious problem that cannot be ignored or overlooked anymore. A body of research has applied the routine activities theory to explain online victimization. The routine activities theory was developed by Cohen and Felsen in 1979. The theory suggests 3 elements that impact crime rates: motivated offenders, suitable targets, and the absence of culpable guardians. They argued that crime occurs when motivated offenders and suitable targets converge in the absence of culpable guardians, and that the probability of crime occurring differs based on routine activities. While other theories have tried to identify the risk factors that motivate individuals to commit a crime, Cohen and Felsen noted that crime cannot occur when the motivated offender fails to meet crime opportunities. The routine activity approach has expanded its boundaries beyond the real world. Whereas most established criminological theories have focused on offending or victimization patterns and characteristics, the routine activities theory emphasized the convergence of space and time that creates a risky situation favorable to victimization. The fact that the routine activities theory considered space, regardless of whether it meant terrestrial or virtual, made it one of the most popular theories for explaining cybercrime. Using SNS, participating in online forums, using internet banking, or making purchases online can all be considered online routine activities. For the last 2 decades, social activities have not been limited to meeting people in person. Having accounts on social networking sites, also known as SNS, and communicating with others via comments is now a new type of social activity. A recent report revealed that more than half of the world's population is active on SNS. In particular, 72.3% of the United States population was active on SNS, while 89.3% of the population in South Korea, a country where the data for this current study were gathered, was active on SNS in January 2021. As the popularity of SNS increases, various concerns regarding the use of SNS have emerged. One of the biggest issues is the indiscriminate exposure to crime and victimization, such as cyberbullying, cyber harassment, and cyber defamation. Fear of crime is a major concept that has been recognized as a target to be defeated since the 1960s because increased fear of crime may atrophy the vigor of individuals' activities. For instance, people may move out of impoverished and dangerous regions, lose social trust, spend more time and money preparing protective measures, and worry about crime when they feel more insecurity and fear of crime. In addition, some of the previous studies have further shown that fear of crime affects one's attitude toward activities in the criminal justice system. It is important to understand the risks and consequences of fear of crime. Many studies have found predictors of fear of crime, and victimization experience was one of them. Despite the fact that the relationship between a history of victimization and an increased fear of crime has been examined by various studies, little attention has been paid to online crime. So here are the limitations from the previous studies. First, despite its importance in recent years, there is a lack of empirical studies that examine cybercrime. Second, among a handful of cybercrime studies, many used a sample of participants in their early adulthood, such as college students. Studies with a broader age group are needed to find out a more general mechanism. Third, most of the previous research has focused on willful behavior, such as online shopping or sending emails. While these activities are performed daily, having an account and access to a website are required prior to engaging in these activities, but these activities has been overlooked in the previous studies. The present study aimed to examine the direct association between the level of engagement in SNS and fear of crime. And secondly, the present study aimed to explore whether victimization experience can mediate the relationship between the level of engagement in SNS and the fear of crime. This study used the data from Korean Institute of Criminology in 2013, and the name of the study was Cybercrime in Social Networking Services and Criminal Justice Responses. A total of 1,000 adolescents and adults who used at least one of 4 major SNS sites in South Korea participated in this study. The number of accounts the respondents had with each of the SNS sites was calculated to get level of SNS engagement and to get victimization experiences on SNS. The study asked respondents whether they had any experience of victimization on any of the 4 SNS sites within a past year. And also for dependent variable, we examined the fear of victimization on SNS, and respondents were asked to rate how much they worry about victimization on the SNS sites. And for control variables, we included gender, age, highest level of education, and monthly average income. The table demonstrates the direct effect of the level of SNS engagement on victimization. The level of SNS engagement was found to significantly affect victimization on SNS. The right column of the table further shows the direct effects of the independent variables on the dependent variable, which was the fear of victimization on SNS. All 3 variables were examined in one model, and the level of engagement on SNS was positively associated with the fear of victimization on SNS. The direct effect of the level of SNS engagement on the fear of victimization, which was one of the key estimates calculating indirect effects, was also significant. Finally, the table demonstrates the indirect effects of the hypothesized model. Victimization experiences on SNS were identified as a significant mediator between the level of engagement and the fear of victimization on SNS. The result equates to the product of the path coefficients between the independent variable and the mediator, and the second path coefficient between the dependent variable and the mediator. This study aimed to examine the association between the level of engagement in SNS and fear of victimization based on the routine activities theory. According to routine activities theory, crime occurs when motivated offenders and suitable targets converge in the absence of culpable guardians. We defined one's level of engagement on SNS as indicating their level of exposure to crime on SNS. The model in this study hypothesized that higher levels of engagement on SNS would increase the fear of crime online. The study also included victimization experiences as a mediator between exposure to crime and fear of crime on SNS. The results of regression analysis showed significant effects on every path. First, the level of engagement on SNS had a positive effect on victimization and the fear of victimization on SNS. Though such a result was expected based on the theory, few studies have found empirical evidence to support this association. For instance, a study tested the relationship between SNS usage time and the fear of crime on SNS. The results show that SNS usage time had no significant effect on the fear of victimization or victimization experiences. The definition of exposure to risk on SNS was different from the present study. However, it is noteworthy that different forms of risk exposure can influence the fear of crime. We defined the level of SNS engagement as the number of accounts with the 4 different SNS sites, reflecting how much the respondent was exposed to the risk. Referring to the contradictory results from the previous studies, we can assume that the difference may have been determined by the breadth of SNS usage, not the depth. More detailed research is needed to investigate the breadth of SNS usage. For example, future studies can examine the number of accounts on one SNS site or count the number of sites respondent uses. Second, experiences of victimization on SNS significantly affected the fear of victimization. This relationship between victimization experiences and the fear of crime was in line with many previous studies. However, less was known regarding cybercrime specifically. Though this study discovered that such a relationship could be extended to crime on SNS, there is still a need to specify the type of cybercrime on SNS sites. Similar to other offline crimes, cybercrime on SNS can have various components. For instance, cyberbullying on SNS sites involves an interpersonal component, while hacking or identity theft does not require interpersonal contact. Since different crime components have different impacts on the fear of crime, the effect sizes in this association can differ based on the types or components of the crime the respondents experience. Finally, victimization experiences mediated the relationship between the engagement level and the fear of victimization on SNS. All of the paths were significant and directed as hypothesized. We concluded that higher levels of engagement on SNS affect the number of victimization experiences, resulting in increased fear of crime. Effect sizes further demonstrated that the direct effects of the engagement level on the fear of victimization were greater than the prior victimization experiences. This result is interesting since the level of engagement on SNS is rather a secondary measure to operationally define the exposure to victimization and vulnerability, whereas the victimization experiences represent itself. It is possible that the timing of the victimization experience might have affected the effect size. Analyzing the data that specify the conditions would help examine the mechanism beyond the present findings. Considering the large role SNS play in social activities and relationships, the findings are important for understanding how victimization impacts fear and may help to inform policymakers on how to help people stay engaged freely in socializing in a safer online environment. This is the end of the presentation, and I would like to thank you for your time and attention today. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Thanks to Nayang and Youngjae. Great presentations and very interesting areas of subject. Juvenile prostitution, of course, is a very serious issue, and it's good to see you've done some work on that, and you've done some excellent work. And the social networking services, of course, have become dominant on the internet, and it's an area that is creating a lot of problems in the area of cybercrime. My first questions I'll ask to Nayang. You addressed an important area in the study related to the need for initiatives to reduce increasing rates of juvenile prostitution in cyberspace. Your attention to platforms such as chat apps used to facilitate such activities speaks to the challenges of how to most effectively monitor and control rates of juvenile prostitution in cyberspace. As you stated, such goals are complicated, but increasingly so given the lax regulatory measures related to cyberspace and cybercrimes. You made a number of references to the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family and their efforts to monitor and identify and file criminal charges against domestic random chat applications that violated the Youth Protection Act. And legislators globally continue to work diligently to enact legislation to make those who produce apps such as Facebook and Twitter and others to take responsibility for what communications occur that could be done for illicit purposes or detrimental to others, such as juvenile prostitution. So my first question to you is, would you comment on whether you think the creators of the apps, such as random chatting apps, should have a moral and legal obligation to monitor activities on their sites to ensure that the conversations occurring on their apps fall within the boundaries of the law? And if they don't, should they be responsible for removing the accounts of those who do not conduct their activities within the boundaries of the law? I look forward to your answer.
Thank you for your question. Above all, I want to say, in my opinion, the obligation, that moral obligation can be the same as legal obligation. Morality cannot be the obligation. Therefore, if the government regulates them with moral obligation, it would cause a great backlash, I think. However, we can make more sense that when society has obligation called law. This is why a law exists, and currently there is no way to take responsibility if there is no legal obligation. But I think if we should enact some laws about the responsibilities of creators. Cyberspace is a society, the same as the reward. The liberty in society means that when we do behaviors without harm to others, we have to respect those behaviors and choices. As cyberspace is a society, in my view, it is a cultural lack that most people defend themselves by saying how liberal that the cyberspace is. I think some people need to understand about cyberspace. For too long, the issue of responsibility has been avoided, and I am not sure whether liberty improves mature citizenship on the internet. As a result, legislation on responsibilities seems necessary to prevent damage and to make people aware that cyberspace is also a social space. We need to realize that online space and cyberspace is a society no different from the real world to get used to. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I've got another question for you as well. So following the points we discussed here, my question is whether app creators allow illicit communications on their sites or fail to prevent those from doing or to continuing to do so. Do you think that those providing those services should be held criminally responsible? Do you think legislatures, and to follow up that question, do you think legislators should be permitted to enact laws permitting the removal of specific applications from the general internet that continue to allow inappropriate and illicit communications to continue on their apps? Thank you.
Thank you. Second question. In Korea, the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family has carried out criminal charges, and maybe this question would be related to this. As I said in the previous question, I am in favor of introducing statutory regulation. It is not clear exactly to what extent criminal responsibility refers to, but it is necessary to be cautious about whether it should lead to criminal responsibility for spending time in prison. However, the reason why criminal responsibility is not completely excluded is because of the characteristic of a cyberspace. In the real world, there is a limit to monitoring people as a person. This is because blind spot exists and the number of watchers is very low compared to those subject to surveillance. However, cyberspace is a sufficiently controllable space, even if the number of observers and the number of targets are not proportional. Because the whole environment of the app is created and it is all possible to control. In other words, we cannot help but hold creators fully responsible when they don't monitor deliberately despite their ability to do so. They are different from witness because they are managers of the space. For example, in Korea, minors are not allowed to buy cigarettes, and if minors buy cigarettes, the store owner, the minor bought cigarettes, is held responsible. But if the manager of the cyber place, where the crime occurred, like juvenile prostitution, isn't held accountable despite having enough surveillance, this is too big a contradiction. However, in my opinion, permitting the removal of apps is too heavy because inappropriate apps are usually made by users, not creators. Therefore, if we enact the laws that allow removing inappropriate apps, we can block challenges of creators. They are not professional in law, and creators are not heroes of justice, maybe. They can make mistakes, I think. So instead of removing apps, we can set up a grace period for creators to modify the app according to the law, and we can warn them to modify. In this way, allowing creators to monitor by the law will reduce their desire to create. However, if they ignore these warnings, we will have to consider removing the apps as the last legal regulation. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, Youngjae, I have some questions for you as well. You noted that more than 50% of the world's population, in your paper, I should say, you noted more than 50% of the world's population is active on SNS, and you highlight double-digit growth rates from activity just from January 2020 to January 2021. Obviously, very big growth rates. You also stated that your study hypothesized that a greater number of accounts may predict a higher chance of the respondent being exposed to victimization on SNS. You also said that the level of SNS engagement was found to significantly affect victimization on SNS. And in your discussion and conclusion of the paper, you recommended more detailed research is needed to investigate the breadth of SNS usage, and that future studies can examine the number of accounts on one SNS site or count the number of sites a respondent uses. So my first question to you is, do you think that a user's risks of being victimized when using SNS are increased by the number of SNS they visit, or do you think that it's more the way in which they use the SNS? In other words, not being diligent in what they disclose and who they freely communicate with? And would adopting a practice of frequenting fewer SNSs on its own have any significant impact on reducing victimization?
Thank you for the constructive comments. The background of this study was from the idea that the users are not really aware of how much information they are providing whenever they make one account. So say I'm making one account in Instagram and another in Facebook. Although it seems that I have provided same old basic information like name, ID, that I prefer, address, email address, I'm providing more information than I think when I start to follow someone or heart to the contents because they show my interests. Making multiple accounts may help to aggregate my diverse interests. So the total amount of information that I've provided in making only 2 accounts can be massive. And I believe this could really increase the exposure to crime opportunities and the likelihood of victimization. At the my results showed that the number of accounts may increase the likelihood of victimization experiences. So as an answer to your question number one, I would say both the number of SNS and the way how the users use SNS affect the victimization. But I think the number of SNS they visit is more deductive from my study results because the variable I used in the study was more about the breadth of the SNS usage rather than the depth, because I did not examine the activities they do on SNS in particular. And you also asked whether the practice of frequenting fewer SNS would impact on reducing victimization. And I would say yes, based on my study results. But at the same time, I also think how active the users are in one SNS site may affect the likelihood of victimization. And I think this kind of perspective would represent the depth of the SNS usage, which is different from my present study. And I think future studies should examine from this perspective and compare the effects sizes between the breadth and the depth of the SNS usage. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I have another question for you as well, if I may. Who specifically are you referring to as policymakers in your paper? Are they the legislatures, other government agencies such as the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission? And do you feel that those who create SNS, such as Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and others, have a moral obligation to help people to stay safe when they're engaging in SNS? And if so, should they be regulated to do so?
Federal regulators, such as Federal Communications Commission, can use the study results to develop prevention measures at the SNS platform level. The results can also be useful for the law enforcement agencies within the U.S. Department of Justice, such as FBI. And especially the FBI is where all the cybercrime complaints go to. So knowing the route to cyber victimization and developing intervention programs to protect victims are especially important for these law enforcement agencies. And you also asked whether the SNS sites should have moral obligations to help people to stay safe on SNS, and I would say yes. And I think they should be regulated to do so. The users would be able to protect themselves by making changes with their account status, which means the protection is only possible via SNS sites. This is why the SNS sites should have moral obligations. And regarding regulations, many people worry that SNS sites taking one step forward on protecting the users might limit their freedom or rights on SNS. But what I mean by having moral obligations and taking measures is that these sites should actively provide prevention measures. So for instance, many SNS sites ask the users to change their passwords, but they also allow the users to postpone the changing process. And we all know that the process makes login much more inconvenient and lowers the user satisfaction. So it is not really preferable for the sites to be strict about this protection policy. And I think this kind of compromise should be disappeared from the moral obligation perspective. And regulating this process by the law does not really violate the First Amendment that many people worry about. And considering the massive damage individuals or business face these days, I think the SNS site should be regulated to implement more strict prevention measures. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I'd like to thank you both again for putting all the work that you did into your papers of two very, very important areas that need more research. I think you both did a great job, and I want to thank you very much for taking time to do that and being part of this fantastic conference. So are there any questions from the floor coming in at all? Just having a look here. I think we're good. So I want to hand the floor back over to Dr. Choi, and thank you very, very much again for your participation, and I wish you continued success.
Thank you, Chris and student presenters. The ION study revealed that juveniles can be more vulnerable in the digital era, and Yeonjae's research highlighted the factors associated with emotions involving cybercrime. I believe that the topics discussed today are very critical for the future scholarship in cybercrime. So that is the end of the student paper presentation session. Thank you for attending. During the award ceremony at 4 p.m., we'll announce which place each winner received. I will see you at the award ceremony. I'll give the floor to Andrew back.
Thank you so much, Dr. Choi. We are going to go into a quick break here, and we will come back at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And we will be hearing from a few more panelists at 3 p.m. So meet us back here in about 12 minutes here. Thank you.